If you value thoughtful, honest conversations about the Orthodox world, subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. You'll get frequent essays, episode notes, and occasional behind-the-scenes reflections that expand on what you hear on this podcast. It's free to join, and if you choose a paid plan, you directly support independent Jewish media and help keep me producing these conversations. Take 10 seconds right now to search for Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack and hit subscribe, or click on the link in the description of this podcast. While you're there, check out my latest 2 articles from last week, Zohran Mamdani and the Jews, and then Standing, Walking, Praying. Thank you for being part of this community and helping us grow. Now, let's get to today's episode of the Orthodox Conundrum podcast with Rabbi Mark Wilds.
I have a hard time tackling other subjects with students when the whole question of the authenticity and validity of God and Torah is questionable. If you don't really believe in God, or you have questions about God, or the authenticity, or I would say the divinity, really, of Torah and Shemayim, very, very hard to have any kind of legitimacy to these other sources that I need to bring up in answering questions about ritual law, about kashrus, about hilchos shchita, about anything in tefillin, mezuzah, tzitzis. Like we gotta first talk about why we value Torah in general. Does it come from a higher place? How do we know that? Why do people believe this?
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Zohran Mamdani is now the mayor-elect of New York City, a politician who openly rejects Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, yet insists that this has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. He points to a small number of Jewish supporters as evidence, while promoting a worldview in which Israel is framed as a genocidal, apartheid project. New York is home to the largest Jewish community outside of Israel. When that city elects a proudly anti-Zionist mayor, it sends a message far beyond the borders of New York City. It raises hard questions. What does it mean for Jewish security, for public discourse about Israel, and for the way younger Jews understand the connection between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism? Does this moment push more Jews to consider aliyah, or does it demand that they stay and push back? And what does kiruv, Jewish outreach, look like in an atmosphere saturated with hostility, confusion, and ideological pressure? My guest confronts these questions every day. Rabbi Mark Wilds is the founder of Manhattan Jewish Experience, which has spent decades helping unaffiliated Jews in their 20s and 30s build a deeper relationship with Torah, Shabbat, and the Jewish people. In our conversation, we talk about what he fears will tangibly change on the ground as a result of the recent election, why the supposed split between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is so dangerous, and how Rabbi Wilds speaks to students who are center-left, skeptical about Israel, or openly anti-Zionist. We also discuss his new book, The Jewish Experience, why he chose to organize basic Judaism around the concepts of God, Torah, prayer, Shabbat, Chesed, and Tikkun Olam, why Shabbat and Jewish wisdom are the best first steps for Jews who feel worn down by the headlines, and how to reclaim Tikkun Olam from its political distortions without abandoning the real Torah value behind it. We also look at spreadsheet kiruv, which emphasizes metrics in determining how successful an outreach program is, how outreach can avoid treating people as projects, and why one small act, a Shabbat meal, a class, even a moment of being pulled into a dance circle on Simchat Torah, can change a Jewish life in ways none of us may even recognize. This is a wide-ranging conversation that touches on many aspects of kiruv, including Ma'amarei Chazal, politics, pet sounds, and Sgt. Pepper, and we'll get to it in just a moment. First, remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, in 2025, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Mark Wilds is the founder of Manhattan Jewish Experience, MJE, a highly successful Jewish outreach and educational program engaging unaffiliated Jewish men and women in their 20s and 30s with Judaism and the Jewish community. Rabbi Wilds earned a BA in psychology from Yeshiva University, a law degree from the Cardozo School of Law, a master's degree in international affairs from Columbia University, and ordination from the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. After serving in rabbinic positions at Ohev Tzedek and Kilat Yeshurun, and teaching at Ramaz and Stern College, Rabbi Wilds established MJE, dedicated to Jewishly engaging the tens of thousands of New York City's unaffiliated Jewish professionals. In its years of existence, MJE has successfully reconnected thousands of previously unaffiliated Jewish men and women with Judaism and the Jewish community. His most recent book is entitled The Jewish Experience, Discovering the Soul of Jewish Thought and Practice. He and his wife Jill have 4 children and live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. Rabbi Mark Wilds, thank you for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me again, Scott.
Today we're going to talk about helping Jews become confident and live meaningful Jewish lives in an environment which is becoming more and more unwelcoming to Jews. And we're recording this several days after Zohran Mamdani has been elected mayor of New York. Of course, for the past 2 years, the anti-Semitism in a post-October 7th world has been growing exponentially, and New York has felt that perhaps as much or more than any other place in the United States. To open up, before we talk about outreach and kiruv, what has changed for Jews in New York in your view? Is the old assumption that New York is the safest place for Jews outside of Israel, maybe even including Israel according to some, still true in your view?
Whoa. Wow. Again, thanks for having. It's really too early to tell whether or not New York, in the last 4 days since he's become mayor, has gotten unsafe. Nothing's happened just yet. I am nervous that there'll be less police presence at our shuls and schools. I am a little nervous about that. We have police officer outside of our minyan almost every Shabbos. And I'm just wondering, if he's serious about defunding the police, whether there'll just be less cops around in general, or because of his positions on Israel, which he claims will have nothing to do with the way he treats Jews. We all know that those two things go hand in hand. We've learned that very painfully in the last 2 years, since October 7th, just a ruse, I believe. And I'm nervous a little that he's just not going to provide the same kind of protection that we might have. But I don't know. Time will tell.
Because I'm personally worried as well that, and again, I'm saying this as someone who's living 6,000 miles away from where you are right now, but in a weird way, obviously, I hope the Jews are safe. Let that be clear. I don't want that to be misunderstood. However, even if he is extremely good to the Jewish community and provides just as much police protection as he always has, or as has New York always has in the past, I would worry that that would actually validate the idea that anti-Zionism can be decoupled from anti-Semitism. In other words, imagine that he's great to the Jewish community and he says Israel has no right to exist as a Jewish state. People may really accept on an even wider scale, I guess it's true, he's not anti-Semitic, even though I believe they can't be decoupled.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an excellent concern. Unfortunately, too many people already accept that distinction. But you're saying that he would further solidify that chiluk, if you will, that distinction between being anti-Israel and anti-Jewish. He's been running on a very pro-Jewish platform, and unfortunately he's got a couple of, I don't want to call them useful idiots. Okay, we'll call them useful idiots who are, he's able to point to and say, hey, look at those Jews. They love me. That's why I was very put off that even though it was a small segment of the Satmar community, I was very, very upset that they met with him publicly, because even if it represents such a small segment, it allows him to be able to say that, the rabbis invited me into their sukkah. And my biggest concern is that it's going to increase the mainstreaming of anti-Israel sentiment in the world, and that more and more people will continue to think that what you and I consider to be Israel's, legitimate right to defend itself, is being reframed as genocide. And that is going to become more and more mainstream, because now you have the mayor of New York City who's established. And I'll tell you one other thing. I heard this from Alan Dershowitz. Alan Dershowitz said something very, very powerful. He's not concerned that he will fail. He's concerned, like you're saying, that he's going to be successful as a mayor. Because if he's successful as a mayor, not just in protecting Jews, but just successful in general, that's exactly what happened to Hitler, Yamach Shemo. When he was elected in 1933, for the next 2 years, he showed Germany that he could improve the economy. He could restore Germany to its former glory, which had been, they had been sort of been neutered since the Treaty of Versailles. And that gave Hitler the platform to do something really, really awful because he had the people's confidence. Right now, there are still so many Jews and non-Jews alike that are very healthily skeptical of Mamdani's ability. This young guy who's organized and run very little in the past, but if he continues to gain confidence in the people, anyone can campaign. He's a charismatic guy. That's my biggest concern, is that he will then have a very serious platform to continue to promote his anti-Israel agenda.
Mark, you work with young Jews in Manhattan all the time. Do you think that they're feeling the shift on the ground, or what you might call the potential shift on the ground? I'm speaking about everything that's happening over the past couple of years. Or is this more something that rabbis and communal leaders are concerned about, but isn't necessarily being felt by the rank and file?
It depends who your rank and file are. The problem is, MJE, we are reaching out to our less affiliated Jewish millennials in the 20s and 30s, and many of them are, most of them are really left of center, if not hard left. And therefore, they don't see any of this as strange or weird. And they haven't really been to Israel, if maybe a birthright trip. And they see a young Muslim leader who is, gifted in certain kinds of areas. His oratory skill, and he's going to help them with their financial woes. He's going to give them free stuff, and so I'm really, really concerned about that. But there is this other group of Jews that are not affiliated, let's say, with the Orthodox movement, but haven't, in my opinion, lost their brains yet, and they haven't been completely indoctrinated, towards the hard left. We still get a lot of those types of Jews. And they're seeing something very, very dangerous about Mamdani, because he's accusing the Jewish state of apartheid and of genocide, and he's not saying it's unique to the Netanyahu government. He's not saying it's this right-wing government that's responding. He's saying it's Israel. And every time they ask him a question about Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state, he never gives a straight answer. And that is definitely alarming the rank and file. It's making people uptight. The question is, how uptight? Because if you're not that connected to Israel, the modern Orthodox community's got one foot in Israel, one foot in New York. So everyone's got a kid or two learning there, making aliyah, considering aliyah. So you get the wrong guy like this in power, it's gonna promote aliyah from that segment. Is it gonna promote aliyah from my students? Right now, no.
Well, do you actually think that aliyah is the correct response to this? I actually wrote an article a few days ago, and I'm not somebody who says that everybody should make aliyah. I'm not somebody who says if you don't want to make aliyah, you should anyway. I certainly try not to be condescending, and that's very much part of my Weltanschauung, to try and allow people to do what they want to do without making them feel that they're not a good Jew if they don't do X, Y, or Z.
Yeah.
And I also said that I was surprised from the little that I saw online that more Jewish leaders aren't saying to their congregations or their students, maybe it's time to at least consider aliyah, not because it's dangerous, but as I put it, we as religious Jews, I'm talking about in the Orthodox community, believe, at least most of us believe, that moving to Israel is something that God on some level wants us to do. We say every day in Tekabah Shofar and Shemona Esrei, please gather us into Israel. So obviously on some level, we think that's a good thing. It's desirable. And I was surprised that more Orthodox leaders haven't said, and maybe they have, and I just don't know, but I was surprised they haven't said, maybe it's time to think about moving to Israel. Maybe this is what God wants us to do. Again, not because you're afraid, but because if things are getting a little bit sketchy or dicey, even just not as comfortable, maybe God's giving you a nudge to move to Israel. And I'm curious if you think that's the right response.
First of all, I'm also a little surprised, and I think your assessment is accurate. I haven't been hearing, rabbis in mainstream pulpits get up and say, come on, this time, this is it. I have a very dear friend who made aliyah literally from down the block. I live on West 86th Street, Upper West Side. And he's waiting for the chief rabbi of England to get up and say, this is it. I'm making aliyah. Who's coming with me? Like Rabbi Riskin did back in the 1980s. I very much believe in something Rudy Rockman. Do you know Rudy? So Rudy is a big, he's spoken at MG many times, and I have a lot of regard and respect for him. He has a very unique view on things. He's been fighting in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria. He's been all over. And his feeling is if you're not going to defend yourself in the diaspora, then make aliyah. It's not an ideological thing. It's more of a, it's not a, well, it is ideology, but it's not like a Torah, v'horashtem et haaretz, yishuv eretz Yisrael kind of ideological stance. We're all supposed to be living in Israel, make aliyah. It's getting dangerous here. He's saying as a Jew, it's an exile mentality to just take it and not respond. So if you're going to go to Colombia, like he did, and I went, and you're not going to fight back, and you're not going to be part of a pro-Israel, and you're just going to go there and put the baseball hat on and take your classes and, keep getting ahead in New York society like we always went to Colombia to do, then make aliyah, because at least you're living as part of a nation that's defending itself. The idea that we would just be attacked, whether it's verbally, it's online, socially, or it's physically in Israel, or physically in the hate crimes are up like 1,000% in New York City. And the idea we would just kind of like bury our heads and go about our business like nothing has changed is really a gullus, exile kind of mentality. If you're not a fighter, make aliyah. If you are a fighter, stay here and fight back. Fight back on college campus, fight back in New York City, elect the right people, promote the next, who's the mayor in the next time or whatever other positions. And that's my feeling. I'm losing it a little for a lot of my friends, relatives that just want to kind of go about business as usual. And we'll still go to Columbia, we'll still get into Harvard and Yale and do all these, go to these best schools. Why? I'm not interested in fighting. I just want to do well. I want to live in the 5 towns or in Teaneck, and that costs a lot of money. And therefore I need I need to land a job in a big law firm. And in order to do that, I need to come out of an Ivy League place. I'm not some ideologue. I'm just from a yid who's trying to live my life. I have very little tolerance for that at this point. I really think we should be yelling, shouting, and fighting back wherever you live.
Well, I'm going to push you a little bit on that just because I'm curious about this. And I'm not even saying I agree with this, but why would someone like Rudy say, and you echo this idea, if you're going to fight, then stay. If you're not going to fight, then go. If you're going to fight, great, join the IDF. If you're a fighter by nature, Israel needs you certainly as much as the diaspora needs you.
I think he's saying it for practical reasons. I think he's saying that most Americans are not picking up and going to Israel tomorrow. But don't just stay here and become the object of other people's hate and anti-Semitic attacks, and don't do anything. Send a check into the ADL and they'll cry out to a few people, but nothing's going to change. He's saying take a stance, stand up, come to rallies, push back. I think in his mind, ideally, and I would echo this as both a rabbi and just a Jew, that we should ideally be living in Israel. I have 2 boys living there, and I'm very, very proud. I'm here because I'm doing what I'm doing, and I love it here. I'm not going to pretend that I'm like, I'm some, saint, some angel here. I grew up in the States. I'm comfortable here, and the work that I do here, I feel, is resonating with my target population, with less affiliated Jews. But I think Rudy was saying that because he knows realistically most American Jews are not picking up and making aliyah, but to just go on business as usual and not fight back. Then go, and he's saying to those Jews, make aliyah, because in Israel you could be protected at least, or you could live in a country that's fighting back. Here, what do you have? We've got a million Jews living in New York City, just going about their business, and just leave me alone. Let me do my thing. I don't know.
Okay, that's perfectly fair. I do want to ask you, though, Mark, because you talked about the center-left Jews who come to MJE, the Manhattan Jewish Experience that you founded and run. How do you speak nowadays to a 25 or 30-year-old Jewish person who is anti-Zionist? How do you even get through? How are they even interested anymore in what you have to offer?
So I'm going to be honest. We have a very self-selective group here. The real hardened anti-Zionist, super left woke, they don't really come so much. I mean, I'm not happy about that, by the way. I'd like for more of them to come. We attract, I would say, Jews in their 20s and 30s who are not Orthodox. They're from the Reform conservative. But as I said before, they haven't lost their minds. There are more on the left, and you have to be careful. I'll give you a little example. Rosh Hashanah, I made what I thought was a very innocuous, respectful statement about Charlie Kirk of blessed memory. And I just said that I was talking within the context of Israel, that we should be grateful to those non-Jews that are defending Israel. And I mentioned Charlie Kirk's name in that vein. A woman came over to me, 22-year-old, and she said, Rabbi, I don't come to temple for politics. And I said, I don't give sermons about politics, and I respect that. And I think it's very dangerous for rabbis to turn their podiums, their pulpits into political, whatever the word is, because it's a turnoff. And I'm trying to do outreach here, and I'm trying to turn people onto Yiddishkeit. I don't need everybody to agree everything that I believe in. But I didn't think I was getting political. She said, well, you mentioned Charlie Kirk's name. So I'm like, well, I think it's incumbent upon us to say thank you, even if you completely disagree with his policies and his views on things. I disagree with a lot of the things he said, but he was staunchly pro-Zionist, pro-Israel, and he did such a good job, defending Israel. We can't say thank you without being labeled like. So it's very difficult. It's difficult because, if you say anything that smacks that you love Trump, but I do think it's important to stay in the issues. And a rabbi that's silent today, that doesn't say thank you to the president for helping to get the hostages out, or thank you to Congress when they pass some pro-Israel legislation, or they send much needed arms to Israel, that's ridiculous. And I don't get a lot of pushback on that. I have to say, I don't get a lot of pushback.
Now, have you seen any people who have had a real problem with Israel in such a way that your outreach has to kind of avoid the subject? Or do you essentially think that Jewish outreach in the Orthodox world today must include a quote unquote Zionist element? Can you really separate it, or do you think it's part and parcel of it?
Listen, I drank the Kool-Aid when I went to YU. I studied Yeshiva at Kotel. I can't separate the two hashkafically. And I don't think a rabbi is worth his salt and is not doing his job if he's not talking about religious Zionism. I believe in religious Zionism, whether it's Rav Kook's approach, the Rav Soloveitchik's approach, and that's why I can't keep quiet about Israel. I will try as hard as I can not to talk about Netanyahu and his government, because that's his particular government, okay? But I'll talk about Israel, and I'll talk about issues affecting Israel, my brothers and sisters in Israel, and Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael, and the IDF. I'm sorry, those are not political to me. Those are existential needs the Jewish people have to survive in the world. And it's part of our Torah of coming back to Israel, which is a meta issue in Torah. I don't have to tell you. Now, does it hurt us somewhat? I could see somebody a little more yeshivish in the kiruv world. Most of the kiruv world's more dominated by people a little more to my right. They're some of my closest chaverim and mentors. But they don't feel the need to talk about Israel so much because they're not so... but I have a son in the army, and I believe in this whole thing. So I'm very emotional about it, admittedly. And I also believe hashkafically that we're not teaching the right kind of Torah if it's not Torah Eretz Yisrael. And I don't think you can pull the two aside. And if somebody were to come and say, Rabbi, you're going to lose less affiliated Jews, I said, well, would you stop teaching a part of Torah you felt was fundamental to Judaism because you felt it's going to put off a certain, you have to put it out in a certain kind of way, but I'm not going to stop talking about it if it's Torah.
And I completely agree with you. And I think that the idea of Torah Eretz Yisrael, however that's defined, whether we're talking about, as you said, Rav Kook, whether it's Rav Soloveitchik, whether it's Rav Shagar, some attitude, some Torah hashkafa that includes an emdah, a stance that includes the current state of Israel. And again, not the government. That's not what I'm talking about. But the state of Israel as a reality given to us by God, as the fulfillment of promises, whatever its status is in the long term of the Geula. I think that not having that means missing the boat. And the fact that I sometimes see some more right-wing kiruv organizations perhaps not dealing with it and avoiding it, as you just said, I find that it's sad. I think it's almost like you're missing the boat. This is the big event, and you don't see what's happening in front of your eyes.
Yeah, and those same organizations, and again, I'm not trying to come down on them. They're my chaverim, my colleagues, and they represent the bulk of kiruv in America. They are dependent on Israel themselves, because the key sign of success in kiruv is getting one of your talmidim to go learn in a yeshiva. And that yeshiva is in Israel, and that yeshiva is being protected by the IDF. The problem also having is really defending the most recent rally that took place, the anti-army, being drafted into the army. That is, my students are, they may not be Orthodox, but they're not deaf. And they see what's going on. They don't understand it. I have to start articulating and explaining why a Satmar Jew would be living in Eretz Yisrael but not serving, or if it's not a Satmar Jew, it's somebody in the Mir. Very, very difficult, to be perfectly honest. And because at the end of the day, I'm holding up Yiddishkeit, and those Jews, to them, are representing Yiddishkeit. And if there's this war, aren't you supposed to defend? And how could you be living there and not defend? And what's the relationship between Torah study and army service? Aren't there a lot of other religious Jews that are in the army, or is that not true? That's a big conversation I've been having in the last couple of weeks as well.
It's got to be difficult. Of course, sometimes when I've heard people have these conversations, at least when I speak to American Jews, you're mentioning now that your son's in the army, and Kol HaKavod, I've always said that the people who have kids in the army who are living in Chutz La'aretz are at the very top of the pyramid of zechut, of merit. I'm very, very impressed with them. The way they raise their kids, that they go there by themselves, enjoy the army, is very impressive. So Kol HaKavod, if I can say that. But people who are in America or anywhere else and complaining about the Haredim who don't serve, sometimes I want to say, well,
right,
you don't serve either. So while I certainly have no love towards this attitude and strongly, frankly, denounce it, the idea that there should be people who don't serve, even though they're religious, at the same time, when someone who lives outside of Israel and has no family in the army starts complaining about it, it seems a bit hypocritical to me.
Yeah, point well taken. Yeah, I guess since my son drafted, I guess I feel like a little better, but it's still not me. So on some level, and he did it. I didn't whisper this. He was in YU, and after October 7th, he heard Rav Shechter in a shir say that Milchemes Mitzvah might demand even Jews chutz la'aretz to go and serve. And he was very, something clicked with him. And it's not just him, it's a lot of people. I'm incredibly proud of him. But I'll tell you, the difficult thing is that I'm promoting Achdus so much because I really feel that post October 7th, the one thing we can do if we're not physically serving is show love for fellow Jews, because so much of this, I'm convinced, is coming about or is impacted by our lack of cohesion and Achdus. And this is creating a problem, obviously, and a rift in the community. So on one hand, I don't want to talk about it. On the other hand, it's the elephant in the room, because my students are asking about it, and I feel passionate about it. But then the more I talk about it, the more divisiveness I feel like it creates. I kind of want to just sweep it under the rug.
Here in Israel, it's a big issue. I'm sure it's a big issue there. Anyway, we're not going to solve it tonight, but hopefully we can at least talk about it and maybe move in a positive direction. I'd like to talk about your book, the new book you just released, The Jewish Experience, which is really, really good. I really enjoyed it. I'm holding it up right now for those people who are watching. An excellent book. You mentioned before that you don't want to not include areas of Yiddishkeit when doing outreach, just because it's not comfortable. You want to make sure you present the entirety of Torah. So that leads me to my question, because it's really interesting how you organize this book. You essentially have divided it into 6 categories of areas that people can get closer to Judaism. The 6 areas are God, Torah, prayer, chesed, Shabbat, and tikkun olam. That's a wonderful organizational tool, and it also leaves out a lot of other things. So I'm curious why you chose these 6 areas specifically.
That's a great question. So I'm going to give you a technical answer. When Corin approached me a few years ago, and they said, "Hey, why don't you write up your basic Judaism classes?" I know some people there. They know I've been teaching, and I was like, I was going to write a big, thick book with like 15 to 20 topics, but nobody is going to read a big, thick book. And to be perfectly honest, I'm just so busy. It took me a long time just to put out those 6 subjects, because they're very broad topics, as you can hear. God, prayer, each one is a book or a series of books.
Of course.
So I just said I'm going to do it in 3 volumes, and I'm going to start with the way I've been teaching basic Judaism classes for the last 30 years. I always start with these that just seem to be the more fundamentals, and I'll give Rabbi Ephraim Buchwald of the National Jewish Outreach Program the credit. This is probably 25 years ago. I wrote a curriculum for him for his basic Judaism course, level 2, but his level 1 had these topics: God, Shabbat. It wasn't Tikkun Olam. I threw that one in. Sexuality actually was one of the first 5 topics that grab people. I don't know. I'm going to save that for volume 2. So I'm going to be working on 2 other volumes with 6 topics each as well. So there's going to be about, my goal is to put out 18 different topics. So it's not like these are the only ones that are important or these are more important. I think to the less affiliated Jew, they are the more, I think to all of us, they're like the more fundamental, quintessential Jewish things like you would want to know about before, let's say, Judaism's take on keeping kosher or Judaism's take on reciting blessings, which are going to be other topics. I think you start with God and Torah, and does the Torah come from a higher place, and so on and so forth. So that was the thinking.
Because I was going to ask you about the lack of discussion of mitzvot bein adam l'makom. It doesn't really have so much about the ritual mitzvot, we'll call them.
Yeah, right. I mean, so the next book will have that. But listen, there's a whole chapter on Shabbos, which is all mostly bein adam l'makom. Obviously, there's bein adam l'chavero component. Yeah. And I tried within the God chapter. Also, there's another reason which your question is now bringing out. Like, I don't think I have a hard time tackling other subjects with students when the whole question of the authenticity and validity of God and Torah is questionable. If you don't really believe in God, or you have questions about God, or the authenticity, or I would say the divinity, really, of Torah and Shemayim, very, very hard to have any kind of legitimacy to these other sources that I need to bring up in answering questions about ritual law, about kashrus, about hilchos shchita, about anything in tefillin, mezuzah, tzitzis. Like we gotta first talk about why we value Torah in general. Does it come from a higher place? How do we know that? Why do people believe this?
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, and I definitely respect that. I want to ask about Tikkun Olam also, and this sort of links together with what you said earlier about some of those center-left Jews who come to MJE, because I say this as someone living in Israel, and it may be different, but from what I understand, Tikkun Olam is often used, or maybe I can even say misused, as a phrase that Jews who are, or might call themselves progressive, will use that phrase in order to talk about supporting certain progressive causes. It could be these are causes that we agree with, it could be they're causes we disagree with, but I believe it's been overused and misused for things for which it wasn't originally intended. The Mishnah mentions Tikkun Olam. It's mentioned in Aleinu. The Arizal then expanded that idea, but it's used in ways now that Chazal would have found foreign, I believe. The idea of Tikkun Olam in its modern 21st century context often means progressive politics. You often hear people say that, and their entirety of their Judaism is Tikkun Olam, whatever that means. So I'm curious, have you encountered that as well, and how you try to combat that? Is that why you put this in the book?
That's exactly why I put this in the book. Because I feel like I want to take Tikkun Olam back. I feel like it's been misapplied, misused, misunderstood. Amiel Hirsch, by the way, who's a very prominent Reform rabbi, he admitted publicly, I think it was on 1840 podcast, that with David Vashevkin, that Tikkun Olam, the Reform movement's promotion of Tikkun Olam, has led on some level to. This was not their intention, clearly, and certainly not his intention, to promote causes that are problematic for the Jewish people. I mean, you have people marching in pro-Hamas rallies, mishum tikkun olam. So and on the other side, because of that craziness, I think Orthodox rabbis have stopped talking about it. Rarely will you find a shiur given about Tikkun Olam, and it's really a meta principle I show in the book. There's so much Torah. I mean, it's 4 psukim in Sefer Yeshayahu. You can't sideline these massive ideas mentioned throughout Chazal. It's used also in Talmudic, Mishnaic literature. Tikkun Olam, about Pruzbul is referred as a legal means.
There it has a different understanding. It's
right, but that's part of Tikkun Olam, and the Arizal that you touched on before is also, I mean, the whole Shviras HaKelim and our fixing a broken world. The last person was probably Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, who wrote a book called To Heal a Fractured World, where he speaks about Tikkun Olam in a very, very positive sense. But I feel like we have to take it back, and I feel that has to be redeemed and understood for what it is, and not truncated. L'taken olam bil malchut shakai. If the Tikkun Olam is contributing to something against the b'malchut shakai, the kingdom of God, then obviously it's being misused.
And just to make sure listeners understand, when it is used in, for example, Mishnaic literature, it largely means just to make sure society functions appropriately, to make sure that things don't fall apart. It's not used as to fix the world. That's the more modern understanding of it.
It is, but it is also, it's the way the Chazal used the term to fix issues that are arising in society. People were not giving poor people loans because they knew their loans would be forgiven during the Shemitah year. So Hillel devised the Pruzbul, and that's Tikkun Olam. That's also fixing the world. I'll mention something else. What happens when you think you're trying to do the right thing and you just blow up one value and you negate another. Last week's Parsha, when the citizens of Sodom are banging on Lot's door. And of course, Lot, as the nephew of Abraham, must have learned from his uncle Abraham the value of achnasas orchim, of hospitality. So what does he do? He offers his daughters.
His virgin daughters. Just take them. Just don't take my guests.
Yeah, so it's like, what? So it's a really dramatic example of how if you allow any one Jewish value to be promoted at the expense of another, you're going to have a fakakta Judaism. And I think that, it's not a new problem. I think we're seeing this,
I actually think, if I could take it even further, and I've said this, that it's more than just a fakakta Judaism. I think it's a type of avodah zarah. I think it's a type of idolatry. If you take one value in the Torah and raise it above every other value in a way not mentioned by Chazal, maybe perhaps you could say Shabbos, because Chazal say Shabbos is equivalent to the entire Torah. Okay, leave that aside. But and we call Jews Shomer Shabbat. That's the term for someone who is keeping the entire Torah. However, to take one value, whether it's Tzniut or Tikkun Olam or anything, and make it the ultimate supreme value before which every other value must bow, I think it's a form of idolatry.
Yeah, and you're basically worshiping something to the exclusion of anything else. And I did bring that up in the first chapter, in my God chapter, where I've had this conversation with a lot of, I wouldn't say atheists, but more agnostics, who will say, listen, we have all these great values in the world already. What do we need Judaism? And my response to them is, first of all, you only know about those values because of Judaism. That's number one. But even if today they're out there, so we don't need them anymore, everybody knows helping that little old lady across the street is a good thing. And stealing, well, maybe not everybody knows about the stealing thing, but, generally speaking, taking another person's life, God forbid, but what happens when one value hits up against another? Where I was just learning with one of my classes yesterday, where a very close friend is getting married on the same day where, God forbid, there's a funeral that you're kind of needed at. How to navigate the complexity of conflicting values is really where Judaism comes to the rescue, because anybody can tell you this in its pure state is great and this in its pure state is evil. But how do you negotiate those different values when they come into conflict with each other? That's what Torah gives us. It gives us a system, and the Gemara is filled with so many different Mamrei Chazals to how to but how to, in what situation does this take precedence over that, and so on and so forth.
I'll even take what you said before and give my own mashal, my own metaphor that I've used in teaching my own kids. For example, when you talk about these values came from the Torah, part of our problem, I use the word problem in quotes, is that nowadays, because we've been successful, and let's say Am Yisrael and God has been successful in having these ideas spread, sometimes some of the chidushim, the innovations of Torah, appear, well, everyone knows that, even though once upon a time they didn't. So my perhaps not so appropriate metaphor is I talk about the great albums of the 60s, the most important music albums in rock and roll. In 1966 and 1967 were Pet Sounds by the Beach Boys and Sgt. Pepper by the Beatles. And
oh man, big thumbs up.
Okay, good. And when I have my kids listen to them now, or other people, and even if I listen to them, they sound great. But it's hard to know why they were so astounding when they were released. Pet Sounds was so astounding that the manager of the Rolling Stones put out an ad in the local paper saying everyone has to buy this album. It wasn't his band. He said, though, it's so important, you have to do this. Wow. And Sgt. Pepper, everyone knows. And you listen to it now, it's a good album, but it's just another Beatles album, frankly. And I say the reason that these don't sound like they're so special is because once they did it, now everyone did what they did. Whether it's the baselines, whether it's the production, the various things that they innovated now have been done by everybody else too. So we can no longer go back into that space and hear what it sounded like to the first people who listened to Brian Wilson or Paul McCartney or John Lennon's ideas. But when you first heard it, it was amazing. So, lahavdil. The Torah, once upon a time, was suggesting things, treating your workers with dignity, giving a day off every week, cruelty to animals being unacceptable, etc. Nowadays, everyone's like, yeah, tell me something I don't know. Says, well, the only reason you know them is because once upon a time, this was Sergeant Pepper. This was Pet Sounds once upon a time, 3,000 years ago.
First of all, amazing analogy. And you happen to choose my, not as much the Beach Boys as the Beatles, but Pet Sounds 100%. There's no question that, we tend to not, make it, we make less of a deal when something has happened already. Dean Carmisi, who was the guy who broke the 4-minute mile, that was crazy. But how many people, within months of him doing that, by the way, broke the 4-minute mile? Nobody knows what their names but that's a very, very important view. Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamb, Zohran Mamdani, I quote in the book also, who shares this idea, can you be good without God? It was a great sermon he delivered back in 1965 at the Jewish Center. In 1965, he said that, of course, we know good people who don't believe in God. We've all met such, decent individuals who don't believe in God. But he says when you pull I'm going to kill his metaphor here, but when you pull the branches out of the ground, they can only stay, or let's say the flowers out of the water, they can only stay alive for so long. And we, he says, back in 65, he says this, are still working off the reservoir, if you will, of that that morality. But at some point, it's going to dry out. So I think it's important for younger people to know where this stuff came from, and that, I don't know, not to pat ourselves on the back, but that the world accepts certain axioms, and like chesed, you said, and mistreatment of animals, that was not, that's 100 years old, in the world. That war is not to be celebrated. How many Jews
The
know
king
that
doesn't make the law, the king is under the law. There are all sorts of examples,
Yeah.
so many of them.
So many, and we should be not walking around arrogant because we gave the world these ideas. But if more young people knew that these ideas were rooted and founded from the Torah, they would be a little more, whoa, oh, didn't realize that. That's a very important idea.
Let me ask you, Mark, when you teach, and you mentioned before the first chapter, God, and in your book, you do talk about how we can find God, whether it's from an inner type of feeling, whether it's from an external proof. How do you balance dogma versus experience? Meaning, how do you balance teaching what Judaism believes versus helping somebody feel Judaism, whatever that might mean for that person? Which do you think should take priority in outreach today?
So this is such a good question. And I have this conversation with other colleagues of mine in the field, because some people think that what I did in parts in the book where I try to lay out dogma and make arguments, logical, rational arguments, like those days are gone. Everything is subjective. Everything is feelings today. The problem is if you trash that whole, and that was, by the way, that was like the bread and butter of kiruv back in the 80s, 90s. Aisha Torah's 3-day discovery thing, where they were kind of attempting to prove, if you will. I mean, it's not really good language, but it's not really proof, but making a reasonable, logical case. I think if you just dump all of that and you get rid of that and you just go to subjective and your feelings, then it's just not going to stand. It's not going to weather people's real lives, because not everybody's feeling motivated all the time. Not everybody's feeling poetic and exuberant and excited and inspired. You need something that's substantive, that you can go to when you're not feeling terribly motivated. And if it's all the dogma and it's all the philosophy and it's all, here's what Judaism says, it's not going to be personal. It's not going to. So I think any decent outreach person, I don't think you can throw one out over the other. I don't think you can go all feelings, all subjective, and I don't think you can go all dogma. It's a very, that combination, there's a sweet sauce in combining the two. And that's what I tried very hard to do in the book, is to try to give both. Finding God from without, which means looking at science and nature, looking at Jewish history, which I think is the greatest evidence of a supernatural creator, But that's not going to be enough because I've met a lot of people who believe in all of that. They buy the whole thing, but it doesn't change their life. They're still not going to be Shomer Shabbat. They're still not going to send their kids to Jewish day schools. It has to be personal. It has to be inspiring to them. And then you meet a lot of people. A lot of people come to MG. They're like riding around on this wave, and it's like they're like up. They love to dance at Arminian, but are they going to wake up Sunday morning and put on tefillin? They're going to go to a shiur. They're going to shell out the $30,000 a year it costs to send your kids to day school. You need something more substantive and more, I don't want to say dogmatic because that word just smacks of negativity for people. But if they're not doing this because they believe in it, because it goes beyond their feelings and their emotions, it's not going to last.
I think that, and I agree with you, but I think that dogma or doctrine about God has to sometimes be seen, not that it's not true. Of course it's true, but it's an arrow pointing to a reality which transcends the words themselves. That has to be true because we know God transcends human language. God transcends anything we can think about him. If somehow we can say this doctrine equals God, that, I don't want to keep throwing around this word, but that's also a form of idolatry because it's not God. God transcends everything. So it has to be seen as an arrow pointing us to greater investigation, greater experience of the divine. That's my take.
Yeah, and that's why the Rishonim, the early commentators, and were very reticent to allowing, even within the tefillah, too many praises of Hashem. Because they didn't want to get into this negative theology where, like, well, if you say Hashem is this, then are you implying he's not that, and Hashem is everything? But the problem is, if you don't do any of that, and I think they were sensitive to this, then we're not going to be able to relate to God at all. So I think it's incredibly important that we don't put all of our eggs in any one of those two baskets. I think we have to do both. And by the way, just one last thing, like when you start becoming close with the student and you see this person's more emotionally motivated, you're going to emphasize that a little more, but you're going to want them to really learn about the doctrines and the ideologies, and then vice versa too. You need that combination.
In fact, the Gemara in Brachos, which talks about the problem of saying too many praises of God. When it says Kel HaGadol HaGibor V'Hanarad, there's a story there where a certain student went up and he started saying the God who's this, so many things. And eventually the Amora who's in front of him, might have been Rava, I'm not sure, said, have you finished saying all the praises of God? And then he gave a mashal. He was being sarcastic, of course. You got them all? You got everything in? And then he gave a metaphor and he gave a parable. He said it's like a king who has lots of gold, has endless gold, and someone praises him about how much silver he has. What I found interesting about that metaphor was that if it really were a parallel metaphor the way we often think of it, it should have been the king has infinite gold and you praise him for having 100 gold. But that's not what he says. He said you praise him for having silver, which the king doesn't have at all. Meaning on some level, by trying to say too much, you're actually falsifying it. It's not even what he has. You're actually getting it wrong. That's why I say it should be an arrow pointing to a reality that transcends the words themselves.
Wow. Yeah, beautifully said.
Let me ask you, Mark, a common critique in kiruv is that people often claim that they were sold an idealized version of Orthodox Judaism, that the orthodoxy that they were taught when they need to go into the real world and they have to pay day school tuition and they have to keep Hilchot Nida and they have to go to shul 3 times a day and they're getting tired of it eventually. They say, you know what, back when I was at this kiruv organization or this kiruv yeshiva, it was so easy. And then in the real world, it's much more difficult than I was led to believe. I'm sure this is something which you think about. How do you make sure that your students, those people who come to MGE, don't fall into that trap?
So I'll tell you, our version of this is, I don't get a lot like, Rabbi, you were bait and switch. You were misrepresenting Judaism, you made it look so sweet and nice. And then the reality is it's so much more difficult. I get a lot of, it's just not as inspirational here. I've gone to 3 different shuls. I live in whatever neighborhood, and people are just not as warm and friendly as they were at MGE. Because we give them a big love bomb at MGE. And the davening is just like, it just feels like people are just trying to get out of there. And the speeches are okay, but they're not like blow away. And that is a real issue. I found that to be the real issue. Because I think people have a sense, people have a sense that we are not sugarcoating, but we're bringing people in little by little. And we're, of course, going to present the more attractive parts of Shabbat before we start hitting them over the head with malachos. with all the prohibitive labors. We're going to start with kiddush and double loaf of bread and the social aspect of the dinner. And then little by little, they'll find out, oh, you're not supposed to get in a car and so on and so forth. But I don't really have such a great solution about the issue I'm contending with. Other than, you know, I'm friends with a lot of the rabbis of these shuls, and I'll call them up and I'll say, you know, I've got 4 of my graduates in your shul, and they love you. They think you're great, but they're not inspired. And I need you to help them stay inspired. I put a lot of people, I put a lot of effort and energy into these couples, and I want them to stay observant. I want them to grow. And I've had that, unfortunately. And I probably had, there are probably about 7 or 8 communities where I'm very close with the rabbis, where a lot of our MGers are. And I talk to them. What is it that, because they're suffering from the same problem. I had one student of mine moved out to the West Coast, and he just said, shul, just davening was so blah. So I said, look, you can keep complaining about it. You have a good voice. See if the gabbai, the chazan, the rabbi is open to having a couple of guys stand around the Baal Tefillah and magnify it a little, create a little ruach, start a little niggin, get some dancing going like we did in as long as the rabbi is not like such a, you know, crazy litvak or yekka that they can't tolerate this at all. And he really helped transform the shul. And I'm very, very proud of that. And I kind of feel like we could be contributing to the shuls, because I don't want to start some separate religion. I'm not going to mention who, but there are other kiruv organizations that like, they'll just funnel them into their own places there. I'm like, first of all, I'm tired enough from what I have to do. I don't want to have to recreate everything. Then I have to start my own shuls, my own yeshivas, because they're not working perfectly for the chevra. Make them work, you know? I don't know.
Okay.
That's my feeling.
That's a really good answer. Then let me ask you, what do you consider, and this is an unfair word, I don't even like the word, but I'm going to say it anyway. What do you consider success when it comes to kiruv? And I'll say why I don't like that word, because it makes it sound transactional. Right. Because if there's a success, there's also a failure.
Right.
Do you have a way of defining for yourself, or perhaps for people who give to MJA, people who care about this, people who want metrics, how do you define success?
So you're hitting like, this is such a major issue for me. Because in the first couple of years, I was very mindful of that. I was getting money from the Wolfson family, and the Wolfsons are very transactional in terms of their kiruv, and they have a right to be. They're giving a lot of money, and they want to see some. And even though I'm not being funded by them anymore, and I really don't have anyone calling me up of my donors and saying, I want to see, you know, show me tachlis. How many people did you? And I hate the term make from. We don't make people from. Okay, people have free will. Okay, they decide whether they want to do this thing or not. But I will tell you, as the boss, I have 4 or 5 other rabbis on my staff and other, you know, rebbitzins and female educators. We speak weekly about people's growth because people are giving money to us. And I do feel a sense of responsibility that the $2.5 million budget we have could be going somewhere else. So what results? So you'll say, oh, well, it's just like we're getting people to feel good about Judaism. Maybe that's good enough for some people. And I've spoken to some of my donors, and that is actually good enough for them. That's not good enough for me. I can't go to sleep at night knowing I'm taking that kind of money from the Jewish people and not seeing some Baalei Tshuva every year. Now, do I only consider people who become Baalei Tshuva to be a success? Absolutely not. Because there are some people who I meet, and I'm a realist, who I don't think will ever become observant. But I could start getting them excited about learning some Torah. I can't stop, but I can inspire them to stop dating outside the Jewish community when they start seeing that there's a value in having some sense of continuity, and that the whole conversion and all this other stuff is not really, really working statistically. So for that Jew, dating Jews is a measure of success. Getting them to learn Torah, getting them to show up on Shabbos, even if it's 11 o'clock before Musaf, that's a success. But for someone else, I have 2 students learning in, I have 2 in the mirror. I have this guy over here. I got a guy in the mirror. I'm like, it's a success for him because he could really go that far. So I don't really have an objective. Like I think it depends on the Jew. I take a different, but I had this conversation, by the way. And if you want to chime in on this, please feel free. I could just talk here.
Well, I'll just say my own feeling is that
Yeah.
I find what you're saying very, very on target, if I can say that, because I think I'm not in kiruv, so it's not for me to say, but I do worry about the objectification of a student in the sense, is he a success or a failure? And I'm also bothered sometimes by the binary nature of some kiruv, where you're either frum or you're not, whereas in reality, if a person comes to MJE on Shabbos when they wouldn't have done that before, even if that's all they do, on some level, hey, that guy has Shabbos in his life. If we look at it like that, of course, if you were to ask that person, or if he were to ask you, should I be Shomer Shabbos 100% and put on tefillin every day? Of course, I think you should. But I'm not going to say that it wasn't a success or this is a failure if that person doesn't go all the way. I think that the fact that you were doing something Jewishly that you would not have done otherwise is a success. I'm also a realist enough to know that when it comes to donors, that's not going to fly.
It's not going to fly, but they're realistic and they know that, it's a Herculean feat for somebody to become a Baal Tshuva, especially today, anywhere, Israel, or, we have a kiruv program now in Tel Aviv. It's just going very, very nicely. And it's not simple in Israel either. And it's certainly not simple here. But I'll tell you, I had this conversation with Rav Moshe Weinberger. He spoke here a couple of years ago, and I had a little time alone. And I told him that it weighs on me. It weighs on me that I have to do a lot of fundraising, and I want to make sure, what do you think is a success? And he said something very, very, he says, he gave a shir about this. He said, you obviously didn't listen to my shir on this. He calls it spreadsheet kiruv. He's very against it because the Rebbe was against it. And if anyone
What does spreadsheet kiruv mean?
That it's like you were saying before, very transactional. Like, I'm only going to focus on individuals if they become frum, and that's my only measure for success, and so on and so forth. And then I remember we had this, he was trying to make me feel a little better because he sees I'm very uptight about it. I feel a sense of responsibility, with the Jewish people's money. And he gave the shir, and then we had a few minutes afterwards, and he walks over to me after the shir, and he goes, you said $2.5 million. He says, it's not even worth one hirhure tshuva. Forget about tshuva, he says, hirhure tshuva. A thought of returning to Judaism, of keeping a certain mitzvah. And that is something that the Rebbe was brilliant. See, Chabad rabbis don't burn out, I think, for a whole bunch of reasons, okay? One of the reasons they don't burn out is because they're not influenced by this. It's a very Litvische kind of problem.
I mean, that fear.
That fear that I'm not I'm not being successful because I only got this guy over here, and they're like, I got a Jew to keep a mitzvah. What he's going to do in 10 minutes from now, that's not my issue. That's not my problem. My job is to try to get Jews to keep as many mitzvahs as possible, and that's it. The rest is in Hashem's hands. And it is a little arrogant. And by the way, I'm speaking to you as I speak to myself because I suffer from this personally, because I think about this. That, and it's not just money, it's the time and the energy you're putting into. And what happens then, because the students feel this. The students are going to be sensitive to this. They're going to feel like, oh, he's not paying attention to me anymore because he realized I don't want to become Orthodox. I'll tell you one quick story that just illustrates this. It was a woman, I remember, very bright. She had just graduated Yale Law School, and she started her first job in New York City, and she was coming to MG for about 6 months. She came every Shabbos. My wife and I had a rover. Lovely. She just stopped coming. So I phoned her up. We got together at Starbucks, having a cup of coffee, and I said, we miss you. Where you been? She says, I thought it over. I really appreciate the way you guys reached out to me, and I learned a lot in the months I was coming, but I'm not really interested in becoming religious. I said, okay, I'm sorry to hear that, but you didn't answer my question. Why did you stop coming? So she said, well, I just naturally assumed because I wasn't interested in being Orthodox that I'm just taking up a seat. So I said, is there anything I said or anyone on my staff, any vibe you got? She goes, no, everybody was like, I just naturally assumed. So people are coming in with this already when they see an Orthodox Jew. They're already hung up on this a little. And unfortunately, this has been a case with other kiruv organizations where we just drop them. And it's very tempting. I had a student of mine. I got very upset. I put a lot of kochos into him. Where was he Yom Kippur? Guy didn't come Yom Kippur. And he said to me, Rabbi, I'm sorry. I'm just not doing so well. I had to work on Yom Kippur. It was during the week. I very quickly got off the phone with him, and I didn't speak to him for like another week or two. He texted me. He goes, are you upset with me? And I said, I'm disappointed. It's Yom Kippur. It's the holiest day of the year. I thought by now you'd And he's like, yeah, I feel guilty. I didn't come either, but like, and I was doing it. I was doing it, and it's
It's
hard,
rough.
because it's really rough, and we only have limited time. So I'm like, what am I wasting my time with this guy? But he's a yid, man, and this guy's brilliant. He's such an amazing guy. And but he came back, and he's coming, and this guy, he comes every week to classes, and he comes on. It's easier to come on Shabbos than Yom Kippur. Do you know that? Because Shabbos is on the weekend; they're off anyway.
Right. Yeah.
We don't think like that.
I guess the way to think about this is when I used to run a yeshiva with Rabbi Pesach Wilicki, his line, which I've quoted many times, is the cement isn't yet dry. You never know. You never know what the thing that you say
That's a great line.
might do. I mean, I often talk about one person who is now religious, living a very religious life, who wasn't even Jewish. And this person told me that the reason that he became religious was one Simchas Torah. He was watching outside. He had one Jewish parent, a Jewish father. He was watching outside, and someone grabbed him into the circle. And for him, that was the first moment of a transformation, because he was interested, but he wasn't really part of it. But somehow that made all the change. And when I spoke to the person who brought him in, I asked him, said who it was. He had no recollection of that. The person who brought him into the circle why would he? He was just dancing a simple story, grabbed him, and that was the end of that. For this person for whom this was the ultimate moment in his life, that was the big moment, and the person who did it didn't even realize it.
I appreciate you sharing that, because I need constant validation and reassurance. I do. By the way, Rabbi Pesach Wilicki, who's amazing, brilliant guy, and we hired him, and he ran a Fairfield Jewish experience for us for 3 years, many, many years ago.
Before he came to Israel, of course.
Yeah. When my friend Shalom Baum was now at Romer in Teaneck, was the rabbi in Fairfield, we hired him together to try our hand at outreach outside of Manhattan. But whatever. You just dropped that name.
Okay. I want to know if you have some advice for a Jew in New York. Let's go back to the beginning. Someone who might not be so affiliated, but who's listening right now. He's upset by everything that's going on. He feels disenfranchised from the world around him, but isn't necessarily ready to jump fully into the Orthodox world. If you want to tell him or her one concrete step in Jewish practice that you would say is a good thing to do in response to the anti-Semitism and the anti-Zionism, which again should not be separated, and all of that negativity that we hear about Jews in Israel, what would be that thing you would say to that person? If you could take on something, what would you tell them?
I would. Can I say two things?
Yes, you can say two things.
I would tell him Shabbos, because Shabbos is the door. It's always been the door. It's always going to be the door. More Jews, I think Chaim Halevi Donin said this in his To Be a Jew, have embraced Judaism through Shabbat than any other mitzvah, and also abandoned it through the abandonment of Shabbat. So Shabbos is just, it's infectious. You do a little, you want a little more. So that would be the ritual. The other thing I would tell him to do is Jewish wisdom. I don't know of another word, and I'm not such a Yiddishist that I'm going to use this word, but it's so geschmackt. It's so pleasurable. Wisdom. Torah, ideology, philosophy, approach to life fills you. It does that for me, and that's why I love to teach so much. But I feel that someone who in their life, and this is so true of so many Jews, so I really appreciate the question, because it's really an important question for so many young Jewish people and older, which is all I'm getting is barrage of anti-Jewish, anti-Israel, you're not getting any of the benefit of the benefits of Jude. Those of us in the Orthodox community, or even if you're not in the Orthodox community, but you have more of a richer Jewish life, you're at least getting the benefits of being Jewish. So you could handle some of the negativity out there and all of the negative stuff that's coming on your feed, on your Instagram feed or whatever. All the nasty things being said about Israel and all the lies being perpetuated. At least I have Shabbos. At least I have this wisdom. I have this great nachas I get when I put down a book after a beautiful meal with my family, and I go to my shul and hanging out at the kiddush with my community, and then I go to this great shir. It's geschmackt. And it's like and I watch my kids absorb it, and I'm getting nachas from my kids doing it, and they're doing it with their friends. And then you have to deal with all the nonsense and the politics and the anti-Israel. You know what it's like to have all of that negativity without the positivity? And I'm sorry to keep doing this in my book, but that's why I wrote this thing now. Okay, I wrote this thing now because for all those Jews or just getting the negative and out of the positive. Here's some wisdom. Here's a one step you can take into it. So I would say Shabbos, and I would say come to a class, read a Jewish book, get into the profundity and the absolute brilliance of Torah.
That's beautiful. And I fully agree with what you said. I'd add something else. I just want to say,
yeah, I'd love to hear.
From your book, I know that this is not what you would say, because you mentioned in your introduction to prayer that you always had a difficult time relating to prayer, that your mother, aliyah shalom, would have a book of Tehillim by her bed and she would be so emotional when she would daven, and you had a hard time relating to that. Your path to God, you wrote, came more through the wisdom of Torah than through the dialogue of tefillah. And I think that what you said is absolutely true. For those who can, I would say, add some tefillah, even a short tefillah.
Yeah.
This is my own experience or my own assumption. But I think for people who can do it or who are willing to try, sometimes it feels like we have no friends. It feels like we as a community are by ourselves. So of course, Shabbos and Torah, going to a shiur, gives you that community. But to be frum for a minute, we have that one big friend, the Rabbi Shalom, the master of the universe. He's our friend. And when we think of him as our friend, not as G-O-D, but as our friend, as Avinu, as the one who can listen and who can pat us on the back and give us a hug. And those who are able to sometimes can get that through a prayer, whether it's a prayer from Chazal, a prayer through Anshe Knesset Gdola, or a self-written prayer. The idea of prayer is another way, I think, that we can maybe overcome the loneliness that we feel.
Wow. I totally agree.
Okay.
It's not for everyone. It may not have the mass or general appeal, let's say, of Shabbat, but meditation is very in today. And if we could also help make that bridge, because it's different than our classic tefillah. But I do think that's a way into Judaism, to have those moments of feeling like somebody does care about you.
Absolutely. Well, Rabbi Mark Wilds, the book, again, is called The Jewish Experience. It's a wonderful book, which I highly recommend. We'll include a link to it in the description of the podcast. And I want to thank you for, once again, I think this is your third time. We'll have a third timers club. But I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. It's been a pleasure.
Such an honor. And I really appreciate you taking the time and reading and really helping, because you're helping me in what I do here and what we do together collectively.
Before we sign off, a brief word of thanks. Several new listeners have joined our Patreon, and I'm genuinely grateful. You're not buying bonus episodes. You're underwriting the work, the research, editing, and the independence that lets us ask hard questions with respect and clarity. If today's conversation helped you think more carefully about Torah, community, and the world we inhabit, please consider becoming a patron. Even a small monthly contribution makes a real difference in keeping the Orthodox Conundrum going and accessible to everyone. The link is in the show notes. To those who have already joined, thank you. Your vote of confidence means more than you know. And to everyone else, I hope you'll consider joining us. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.